Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. A huge day in this year's World Championship. Qualifying for the Mexican Grand Prix went just as badly as Oscar Piastri could possibly have feared. Yeah, not out in Q1 or Q2, but nearly just as bad. Lando on pole by a substantial margin, and Piastri 6/10 adrift and way down the order in terms of positions. Not a good day either for Red Bull or for Max Verstappen. That puts all of a sudden his title charge into serious question. With Lando Norris all of a sudden, if he can survive turn 1 tomorrow against the Ferraris, looking in a great position to close or even take the championship lead tomorrow. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Apologies if the voice is just a little bit cooked today, but we've got plenty to dive into regardless. I want to start with the budget cap because there's a lot of drama about this right now. A couple of days ago we heard rumours that Aston Martin is basically they had a procedural breach, a minor breach. It's not going to be a big deal, but there is at least one more team, possibly two, that are over the budget cap in a more substantial way. This would have major consequences. There are even some rumours emerging that whatever team this might be could face major sporting consequences, right? We're talking, look, disqualification from championships is probably the last resort, but reductions in points, reduction of wind tunnel testing time, or a penalty in terms of their cost cap in future years, or whatever the case might be. Rumour has it looks pretty bad, potentially for one of the teams. Now, of course, the question is which team, and people have been speculating left, right, centre about this. De Kessa says, closely with, affiliated with Ferrari, not affiliated, but close to Ferrari, he says Aston Martin, that's the minor clarification. Ferrari, though, are compliant with the budget cap. We saw that Mark Hughes, another respected journalist, effectively implied that Red Bull are also safe. Now, would this be doing the rounds to such an extent if it was like Haas? Now, okay, Haas don't even have the money to break the budget cap, but you know what I'm saying, right? This probably wouldn't be as big of a story if it at least wasn't rumoured that this might be a top team. Look, Williams has been one of the theories going around because we know they had a lot of crash damage, sure. Maybe they will suffer serious consequences for that, who knows. But I kind of doubt that this would have turned the tide and been such a key talking point if it wasn't at least possible that it could be one of the big dogs, right? We're talking of the big dogs remaining. Can't be Aston because they did a procedural breach but not a major one. De Kessa says it's not Ferrari. Apparently it's not Red Bull either. So who is it, right? Could it be Mercedes or McLaren? So this is the key rumour as it stands. Of course, McLaren, they've done a lot of upgrading over the last couple of years. They've done a lot of research, a lot of engineering development has been done with that team. They've found a lot of incredible innovations on their car. One might argue, did they spend a bit too much on the catering budget to make that happen? It's a fair question, I think. Is it McLaren? Who knows? They did win last year's Constructors' title. Is it Mercedes? Obviously, we also don't know. This is pure speculation at this point, but of course it's a theory going around as to what teams could be involved. I would be surprised if it was Mercedes, just because what happened in 2021 and Mercedes, the way they are as a brand, if they were to be seen as kind of like cheating on like budget caps or whatever, it's always interesting. Like when Red Bull break the budget cap, it's kind of on brands as, yeah, sure, there's consequences. But if a brand's like an Audi or a Mercedes, especially like these German brands tied to some degree to like the VW emissions scandal and all this stuff, like the implication of some of these big manufacturers cheating on anything just has serious PR implications for the brand. And it might not seem like a big deal, but the teams do care about that stuff. So I think Mercedes especially are a team that really wants to make sure they're doing fine. Maybe that applies slightly less to McLaren, but look, who knows? Who knows who even broke the cap, if anyone even did. Of course, Zach Brown, not the Zach Brown, as in Zach with a K, but he says, if McLaren did break the cap, I think, the FIA, take it easy, 50 World Championship points deducted, so Ferrari win. Could be crazy. Imagine it was McLaren and Ferrari get last year's title retroactively. That'd be wild. Reduction in ATR, big fine, disqualifications. It is also a question, and it was a conversation in 2021 as well, when Red Bull were over the cap and there was all this drama, but it was kind of the first year, so they got away with a little bit of a slap on the wrist, really. But there was talk that, okay, well, if you spend more money in one year, that means you have more time that you shouldn't have had to develop the following year. So does that mean that there should be consequences going forward as well? And that is also an interesting conversation to have. There is an argument that such penalties could carry forward. So who knows where that's going to go over the coming days. Now, Max Verstappen, title charge. He's been on a rampage the last few Grand Prix. Was it going to last forever? Look, it may continue tomorrow. His record around Mexico is very good. But was the Red Bull going to keep delivering at the god tier level that it has been at for some time forever? It is the RB21 after all. It doesn't seem to be a total rocket ship. It was a struggle for 14 rounds of this season. For the last few rounds, Max has looked impeccable. But this weekend's, the Red Bull's been a handful. And if you watched any onboards with Max during Sector 2, even when he was trying to take it easy, he was getting snaps of oversteer left, right, centre. Now, we know yesterday his one-lap pace was great, but his long-run pace was horrific. So Red Bull tried to find a balance there, and the balance they found didn't seem great, but it did help the long-run pace, right? His long-run pace in practice 3 today was definitely a lot better, more consistent, so there is that to go on, but it did come at the cost of qualifying performance. McLaren, it seems, looks to go slightly the other way, and also, it is worthy to note, I'll just say this before I forget, those massive cooling louvres on the other cars we talked about yesterday, compared to the tiny cooling that McLaren have, that is designed to run in free air, right? Like, if you've got not much cooling and you're running in dirty air all the time, that is going to be a challenge for cooling, especially in Mexico when there's not much air up at altitude. So, it's designed to qualify well and hold on, right? Whereas for Piastri, he will have to do some serious overtaking tomorrow. We'll get into that. Now, Max talked about in 2021, it was a titanic battle, right, between Hamilton and himself, and we know all the drama from that season. But Max is like, look, the McLaren drivers, they've been getting into some fights lately. I can let them take care of themselves. But the reality is that over the last couple of Grand Prix, there has been a major performance differential. Piastri has not had a run of 3 races without a podium since this exact time last year. And it was these exact races where he was struggling. So maybe it shouldn't be a massive surprise, but it's just in the way that this championship has gone, with Piastri just being pretty ultra consistent, always doing a lap that's good enough for P3, albeit maybe not spectacular, not making many mistakes, not losing points. All of a sudden his pace has just dropped off massively. Now, the Red Bull has made some progress that's helped that happen from their perspective. There is a lot of talk about the upgrades they've brought. Have they gone too far? They brought another change this week. Was this one finally one step too far, right? Have their upgrades not fully worked? Because there is an argument the Red Bull have made a lot of progress lately. They may feel that everything they touch is turning to gold. Every new upgrade they slap on the car is just going to keep making it faster and faster. That may not be the case forever. They brought a new floor this weekend. Doesn't really seem to have delivered much. And of course, they are sacrificing inevitably something for next year as a result of this. But Marco says, look, Toto said the same thing in 2021. We put a lot into that championship. They thought that they were going to hit the ground running in 2022, but of course, it ended up being the other way around. But again, this weekend's Red Bull bringing the majority of upgrades. Now, most of these upgrades are cooling related, like circuit-specific stuff. So it's not massive in terms of changes, maybe. Like Ferrari, it's a couple of cooling changes. For the other teams, it's mostly a similar thing. But Red Bull have brought actual performance changes, as they have done for 9 out of the last 10 Grand Prix. So practice gets underway. This was quite the moment, right? Piastri was sitting here in 14th in the 3rd practice session. Okay, the gaps were very tight indeed, but we had the cameraman zooming in on Piastri 14th and then panning up to Norris in 2nd, which I thought was some, incredibly demonic work out of the cameraman. But in the end, it was Norris P1, Hamilton P2, Russell P3, and these were the times out of the final practice session. Really, this was Lando all the way. The lap that he put in at the end was pretty special. 6/10 on Oscar, and I find it so remarkable. The gap between Oscar and Lando the last couple of weekends, has been either 6/10 or 3/10. It's either they do laps and they're 3/10 apart or they're 6/10 apart. And we've seen that in qualifying. We saw it in race pace. In Austin, it was 6/10, the gap in race pace there. And in qualifying today, we saw a very similar story. So it was the same thing in practice. Now, there was once upon a time 6/10 off your teammate might have qualified you 3rd or 4th. That is not the case in modern Formula 1, and that's going to put Piastri massively on the back foot. As I say, does the McLaren have a huge amount of straight line speed? Not really. Does it have potentially problems following it closely in dirty air with the cooling setup they've gone for? Possibly, right? Like, McLaren's just love leading the Grand Prix. And I know that there's been talk about their drivers maybe not executing well enough, but I think it's relatively clear to see that the McLaren is not as strong in dirty air following other cars as some of the other cars on the grid are. It is, however, mighty in free air. And, well, Lando puts himself in a great position today to make that happen. So we get into qualifying. Again, if Lando was in the free practice world championship, he would be dominating it. But that's not how the points are decided when it comes to Abu Dhabi at the end of the season. But he's led 24 practice sessions. Oscar's led 12. Leclerc's led 6. Hamilton 3. Max 3 even, despite the fact that he is very much still in the championship hunt. But maybe not. Charles Leclerc says, if I had $1 to put on the championship, I would choose one of the McLaren drivers. 40 points is still a lot. And look, it requires Max to gain 9 points, 8 points a weekend on Oscar. But as I've said for the last few days, people who were discounting Lando from this title race were not seeing the bigger picture here. Now, yes, you can criticise Lando for his mentality or whatever, and I've done that plenty of times before, but I will also be very truthful in admitting that over the last few weekends, Lando has impressed me massively, and he looks primed to, frankly, take this championship. It looks like he might take the championship lead away from Oscar, maybe not this round, but over the next couple of rounds. Max, as amazing as he is, can't do everything all the time when the car isn't underneath him, and we've been proven today that the car is not always just automatically going to be there. So qualifying gets underway, and this was always going to be critical. Now look, it's Mexico. Things can and do and have got messy before at turn 1. They may happen again. Being on pole, is it really where you want to be? Maybe not, but would you prefer to be on pole than second or fourth or whatever? Maybe you would quite like to be third. That's where Hamilton sits. We'll get to in a second. Now, the Racing Bulls were surprisingly rapid in the early part of the session. It didn't really work out like that to the benefit and the cost of certain drivers. But early on, Lawson, Hadjar were banging in some pretty good laps. Hamilton then went 3 thousandths behind Hadjar in P1 or in P2, in Q1, of course. Now, already in Q1, things were getting a little tasty down the back because Lando was here. Again, Oscar was almost exactly 2.5, 3 tenths behind at the time. But that put him in a little bit of a precarious position. He made it through without too much difficulty, but, Piastri P10 in the first qualifying session, not optimal, but okay. Bortoletto, Albon, Gasly, Stroll and Colapinto, they bowed out. Albon having a difficult second half of the season. I know this car's been causing him some problems, but, Sainz, I think, has done well to kick on from the middle of this season, despite the penalty, of course, that he incurs. That does benefit Piastri, would you believe it? Now, the second qualifying session gets underway. The amount of laps this weekend I saw Lando just go purple, purple, purple was actually extremely impressive. I've been critical of Lando for understandable reasons so far this season. When the pressure's on, delivering the key lap under pressure, he's not done it, right? Too many times this year, he failed to deliver a key lap in Q3 when it mattered. Now, yeah, this was Q2, but today, Q3, Lando couldn't have executed it any better. Very solid banker, and then banger pole lap. Like, that is what you do as a top-tier driver in a top-tier car. Lando's not done it enough this season, but he's done it when it's mattered at crunch time. Now, yeah, there's a few Grand Prix to go. I said a few days ago, don't overlook Lando as the title favourite. Jensen Button also thought after Austin, Lando is now the title favourite. And I could certainly see that argument. And yeah, maybe tomorrow doesn't go to plan, who knows. But even then, even if tomorrow doesn't go to plan, I can still see the logic behind picking Norris as the favourite. But he's on pole. And Q2 was a minefield for Piastri. His first lap was on old tyres, but it was a second off Lando. Now, he said he had an issue at turn 5, and this is all of a sudden, here we go, right? There starts to be talk about sabotage. And look, it does feel strange. Not to say it can't just be, I wouldn't even say coincidence. I think there are reasons for it. Do I think the reasons why Piastri has fallen off as of late are because McLaren are somehow sabotaging his car? No, I don't think that checks out with the logic of what we have seen so far this season. But look, he had a bit of a power unit issue. It doesn't seem like that power unit issue was still there as the session went on. He did squeak through into Q3. He knocked out Tsunoda by 800. I mean, look how tight it was there. Piastri was 7th, just over Antonelli, Behrman, Hadjar. I mean, Lawson didn't get a time, and if he did, who knows if he could have been higher up. So, I mean, I feel kind of bad for Yuki, right? Because he was 2 tenths off Max, which is very respectable in the grand scheme of things. around a track that we believe Red Bull might use to base a decision on. And he was doing a pretty good job today, I thought, Yuki. But unfortunately, 2/10 is P4 to P11. So he was out in Q2. Lando was P1. Hamilton was right there. And of course, going into Q3, we have to start to talk about these Ferraris, because they did it last year around this circuit, where they kind of came out of nowhere to be remarkably competitive. And they've done it again. Leclerc put in a lap pretty much out of nowhere to go purple, green, purple and beat Lando's time by a couple of tenths and stick it on provisional pole position. This was a remarkable lap. We know that the Ferrari can be good around here, but the fact that they found so much time in the final part of qualifying, they've actually put together a car that looks competitive. It's what we said, right? The Ferraris at some weekends, or the McLaren, or the Mercedes at other weekends, they will prove critical in this title fight, and so it has proved again. If it wasn't for the Ferraris, it would look like a very different front row of the grid tomorrow, where Max would be, where Piastri would be, and how the race would line up. But the Ferraris have thrown a serious spanner in the works. It could really play to Lando's benefit, right? If he can hold them off and the two Ferraris end up as a bit of a roadblock for the other drivers. Or maybe they could cause them issues, right? Because Ferrari are going for the win tomorrow. There is no doubt about that, the way that they are positioned. Leclerc did a great job, but again, I will say, for Norris's perspective, solid banker lap, 3/10 up on Piastri, 3/10 up on Verstappen, who was really struggling in that middle sector. The car looked an absolute handful, that Red Bull. Maybe it'll be better tomorrow, but he's not qualified as well as he might have done. If Verstappen could have been third, I think he'd really fancy his chances. But yeah, qualifying where he did was tough. And Q3 comes to a close. Lando puts in just a storming final lap, a 1:15.5, purple, purple, purple again. Look, Leclerc did a great lap. Hamilton did a great lap. They couldn't get within, Hamilton was a tenth of Leclerc, 3.5 tenths of Lando's time. And Piastri was 6 tenths off Lando's pole lap. Max was 5 tenths off for fifth. Russell was fourth. Antonelli was sixth. Honestly, great weekend from Antonelli. Less than a tenth away from Russell. He nearly got knocked out in Q1. I was glad he didn't, because I thought that he had something to show. That he did. Sainz qualified 7th, also ahead of Piastri by 0.02. That will reverse, though, when Sainz gets knocked down due to his penalty for crashing into Antonelli back in Austin. So Piastri tomorrow will be 7th on the grid. Hadjar will be 8th in the end. Behrman will be 9th, of course, with Sainz dropping down to P12. But a remarkable turn of events, right? These last few days have been, from what's happened back in Baku to in Singapore to all of a sudden turning up to Austin, and Lando staying composed, right? Like, as I say, the execution that Lando has shown these last few weekends is that of a driver who can win the world championship. And is he now the favourite to do so? Look, it's only qualifying. Everything can happen on the 800-metre run down to turn 1. Max had this to say. He was like, look, difficult day, leave it there. I'll talk about the rest with you guys back in the garage a little bit later on, because clearly Max is frustrated about the way that I handle things. Again, Max made a lot of comments in the media the last couple of days saying effectively, look, if I win it, I win it. If I don't, it is what it is. We tried, right? So I don't think obviously Max wants to win, right? And a 40-point deficit to a struggling Piastri and only a 26-point deficit to Lando, he'll think that's doable in a 5-round stint. But on today's evidence, who knows if that's even, really on the cards any longer. So Norris on pole, Leclerc, Hamilton, Russell, Verstappen, Antonelli, Piastri it will be, down in P7, a lot of work to do. Look, if Lando wins tomorrow, Piastri the last 2 years was 8th, today in qualifying he was 8th, let's say Piastri gets up to 5th or to 4th, let's say 5th. 5th gets you 10 points, right? 25, 18, 15, 12, 10. Gets you 10 points. If Lando wins, the championship lead comes back to Lando Norris with several rounds to go. Momentum clearly in his favour. So a huge day for the championship today. Not just for Piastri, but of course also for Max Verstappen's recent title charge. But look, it's pretty difficult to hold on to the lead from pole position in Mexico, right? We know how long that run is. The Ferraris will be all over Lando, right? And he may need to yield. That may cause problems down the line. Who knows what happens tomorrow? It's going to be exciting. But yeah, great for the championship again in terms of getting things a little bit tighter, a little bit closer. I wouldn't say there's a clear favourite emerging yet, but I'm sure the odds might have moved over the last couple of hours. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.